Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Wednesday, October 30th, 2024, 6 days until the voting ends and the counting begins. I am John Podhortz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, we are delighted to have with us our old friend, NBC News political correspondent, Steve Kornacki, the man with the board, the man we are going to be watching minute in, minute out next Tuesday night, the way some people were watching the Yankee-Dodgers game last night. Thank God for at least some respite from a very sad outcome that we might have had. But other things happened last night, aside from the Yankees finally getting their bats out and winning 11-4. A lot of action, political action yesterday. Trump began the day with was called a press conference. One of his amazing press conferences where he takes no questions from the press. So it's a new definition of the term press conference. It's like press audience with a lot of people from Mar-a-Lago applauding while he's speaking, not ordinarily a press conference dynamic, introducing his or showing this incredibly powerful ad with Justine's mother, Justine being a 12-year-old girl who was raped and murdered by an undocumented immigrant. And doing some other stuff. And then, of course, Kamala Harris speaking before 50,000 people on the mall saying we need to stop being so divisive. And then somebody decided about around the same time to have a briefing or press availability for Joe Biden.
It was a Zoom call. He was on a call with support.
He was on a call with supporters at the same time. And talked about the Tony Hinchcliffe bit about how there's an island of floating garbage in the middle of the ocean, and it's called Puerto Rico. And the president of the United States then said all of Trump's supporters are garbage, which ended the day in a place we did not expect. Steve, we are 6 days out from the election. I have this simple question to ask you. You are like looking at your own polling, NBC's polling, everybody else's polling. It seems to suggest that the number of people who remain undecided in this race is incredibly small. And so ads to persuade people to vote on affirmative action, on illegal immigration, ads that attempt to characterize Trump or talk about Trump as being someone beyond the pale, all of that. These are ordinarily called persuasion ads, or this is a persuasion discussion. We have final arguments being made, like this is a courtroom. Is there actually give in this last week that's going to determine the election, or are we down to technical skill in turning out the vote? If these polls are right, like 3% of the American people remain undecided. I mean, maybe they're just pushing everybody into one category or the other, but that would not seem to be a time in which to start trying to tell people now they shouldn't be voting for Kamala Harris because of her views on immigration. Or am I misunderstanding what's going on?
I mean, just by the numbers in our most recent NBC poll, we have a category of persuadable voters, and 12% of Trump supporters said that they might change their mind. 7% of Harris's supporters said they might. Now, that's self-reporting. Who knows? But that's the data we have on it. I think the biggest variable, when I look at this is, I mean, it's such a cliche, but I think turnout's likely coming down from where it was in 2020. And then there just becomes a question of, I think the lower it gets, the more likely it is to favor, the Harris side of it. I think the closer it gets to 20 levels, the more favorable it will be to Trump. I say that only because our poll was clear that Trump's support is the strongest with the voters who have not typically participated in elections and who rate their interest level in this election at the lowest end. And so I do think there's to me, the last couple of days between Biden last night and then the rally on Sunday, there's a slice of voters, I suspect, I don't know how big, but it's some kind of slice of voters who are resigned to voting for one or resigned to voting for the other or felt that way. And the question is, do they get a last minute, hesitation that either keeps them from voting at all or actually causes them to switch? And I think each side's worst liability was kind of reinforced in the last couple of days. On the Trump side, I do think there are some folks. I'm thinking in my mind of some of these suburbs that haven't fully made that jump to the Democratic side. Some still strong Republican suburbs north of Atlanta, places like this. There are voters there. Think of like a Brian Kemp voter in Georgia. Is that voter given pause by everything they're seeing about the rally? And then on the other side, Harris is the vice president in an unpopular administration. Joe Biden's approval rating just 43%, and her connection to Biden and all of Biden's limitations. It was all, and in Biden, of course, even without the last few years and the concerns about his age, it's been a long-standing thing with him putting his foot in his mouth on all sorts of things. So all of sort of the worst of the association with Biden, I think, was just reinforced last night too.
Can I ask? I'm curious because you're mentioning the suburban voters. We've seen a lot of discussion of how Trump is drawing more of the male vote, particularly Hispanic men, African American men, at levels that Republicans generally don't attract. But men also don't vote. They don't turn out to vote as often as women. And the suburban women who have been the target, I think, of the Harris campaign for the last couple of months, in a pretty sustained way, given the sorts of podcasts she's been on and the things she said and the way she speaks about a lot of these issues, not just abortion, but a lot of issues. Do you think, is that balance? Is it possible that Trump can actually get those men to the polls? Because that's the turnout issue that I know the least about, but that I think his campaign is relying on. Is that possible?
It's possible, but I think that's where it gets to the, I'm saying about, I think the lower it gets, the sort of the voters who start to fall off, the lower you get in turnout. One of the first groups to fall out are unlikely male voters, particularly unlikely non-white male voters, younger non-white male voters. I say this just based on when you look in the polling and you ask, did you vote in the midterms? Did you vote in a special election? Did you vote in a presidential election? You get the most no's, the more of those categories you kind of layer on top of each other. So those are exactly the kinds of, the Harris folks believe, that this is going to be something akin to 2022, that there's going to be massive, female suburban turnout, young single females. They think that's a group they can grow. They think that's a group they have grown. And the Republicans believe that, and I think you talked about this on your podcast last week. I hope I heard it here. I heard it somewhere, but the gender gap we have been conditioned to think of as netting out to the Democrats' benefit. And the Republicans believe the Trump folks believe it's going to net out to their benefit. And I mean, we've had two polls here. We had the gender gap in our NBC poll 2 weeks ago, men plus 16 Trump, women plus 14 Harris. And we had a new one from CNBC. They used the same pollster as us this week, men plus 17 Trump, women plus 12 Harris. That's what the Trump folks are pointing to.
So you're saying that in the poll that you had in the persuadable category, you had 12% of Trump voters and 7% of Harris voters. So that would answer my question in a way that I did not expect, which is that if you aggregate those together, theoretically, almost 20% of the electorate is persuadable. And on the other hand, what you're saying is that we saw this insane turnout number in 2020. 155 million people voted in 2020. That was an increase of almost 30 million over 2020 over 2016, 30 million people. Now, a lot of that was everybody was at home. Nobody knew what the hell to do. You got a ballot and you mailed it in. You didn't stand online and all of that. This was the question. Have we created a new voting baseline in the United States in which close to considerably more than half of the adult voting age population of the United States is now going to vote in presidential elections? Or will we fall back to more relatively normal numbers? 130, by the way, which was the turnout in 127 or whatever in 2016. That was a high turnout. We thought that was a high turnout, and then this number popped up in 2020. So the question, I guess, is the persuadable category in these polls is that also I may vote, I may not vote? I'm not that enthusiastic about either of them. Yeah, well, maybe I'll go. Maybe it'll be raining.
Yeah, it's well, yeah. So we have a separate category for that. It said that you would layer in 2% overall in our poll said undecided, and then there were 4%, 3 or 4% on top of that who said they're going to vote for one of the third party candidates. So overall, our pollsters said they think in the entire electorate, they put all of those in their category of persuadable. So they said in the entire electorate, they say it's 18% overall that they put in the persuadable category. And again, that's a mix of some saying, I could change my mind on Trump or Harris. I'm undecided purely right now, or I'm going to vote for Ad Stein, or I'm going to, one of the third party candidates.
Okay, so what happened last night then, if you want to look at it that way, is the Democrats got an opening to talk to persuadable voters on Sunday night with Tony Hinchcliffe saying that Puerto Rico was garbage. Hundreds of thousands of Puerto Rican voters in Pennsylvania. Maybe they have, they're hearing the call of their homeland and feeling, sentimental, and they're angry because this is not the way you should talk about a place like Puerto Rico. So the question of what Biden did last night was whether he just took a giant foot and stepped on this potential Harris advantage, because now you have Puerto Rico is garbage. All Trump supporters are garbage. Like they're not. She now can't really run with the garbage story so easily without reminding people of Biden's remarks. And Tony Hinchcliffe is a comic with a podcast, and her surrogate is president of the United States.
But isn't it worse than that, to steal Abe's line? Because she has to make a choice like Governor Josh Shapiro did. Shapiro came out and said, this is, I don't believe this. I don't believe that half the country is garbage. She either has to outright say, I don't agree with what my boss just said. She has to say nothing, which is also saying something about what those remarks meant. Or it's a terrible trap. It's a trap she's been in throughout this election with regard to, Biden's tendency to step on a rake every few weeks. But what she has to do something, I would assume. But the question is, will she go the Shapiro route and just make a statement saying that I don't agree with this, or that's not how I would talk about half the country? Because her speech last night was very conciliatory. She said, he has an enemies list. I have a to-do list. I want them to come to the table. If people disagree with me, I will have them come to the table and argue. So it's undermining that message. But shouldn't she have to say something about it?
I mean, if you're explaining, you're losing. That's the famous line in politics is you never want to actually have to explain. Let me just explain what happened. Really, it wasn't as bad as it sounds. I mean, so she may or may not have to. It does put her on the back foot. Anything she does puts her on the back foot, only in the sense that I was just listening to the Hacks on Tap podcast. That is David Axelrod, Mike Murphy, and John Heilemann. And it was taped yesterday afternoon. And they were over the moon about what had happened at the rally and talking about what had happened at the Madison Square Garden rally and, jackboots and hundreds of thousands of people in Pennsylvania. And, this is the last thing that Trump needed, and this is the light of people in Mar-a-Lago are pulling their hair out and all of that. So they taped this before this unexpected intervention by the president out of nowhere in the middle of Kamala's speech. I mean, it came out like 5 minutes after she was finished with her speech. And so you could see there one plausible future for the next 6 days, which is, do we really want to get back into this with this guy and the people who talk about Americans in this horrible way? We're so much nicer. We're really not going to do this to you. And then this happens. So to call this I would say people like that who want Harris to win would look at this as a gigantic blown opportunity, or at the very least, the end of a line of attack that they thought that they could use over the next 6 days. Not the main line of attack, but just something to add to their an arrow in their quiver as they're sort of going forward.
I think there's another real opportunity in this for Harris, actually, because first of all, she might be asked about what Biden said, in which case she's explaining not because she decided to come out to explain, but because she's being asked, and she will have to say something along the lines of what Christine said. But also, this could finally force her to give an answer to the question, where does Biden end and where do you start? How do you distinguish yourself from this administration, from this president, from his mistakes? A clear line drawn at this late date couldn't hurt her.
I don't know. I mean, I figure, and Steve, maybe you can help us out here on sort of topic-wise, like, there's got to be a reason she isn't doing it. I mean, there's got to be a reason. She says, I'm going to be a different president, I'm going to have a different presidency, but it's a deliberate choice to go on The View and say, I can't think of a thing I would have done differently from Joe Biden. That's not something it's not a gaffe in that sense. It was a choice. It's a question she knew she would have to address. What is it that she would fear, or what is it that the data show about how, say, her base or Democrats feel about the Biden administration and its accomplishments that would put her on, that would mean that she would be making a mistake to separate herself policy-wise?
No, I can't see much in the. I mean, again, I think one of her biggest liabilities it's pretty clear in the polling, is her connection to Joe Biden and is assessments of how the last 4 years went, how the administration's handled any number of issues, starting with the economy and inflation, perceptions of Joe Biden, his ability to do the job, all of these things. I mean, the most striking finding in our most recent poll to me was not just that Biden continues to have the very low approval rating, but also that Trump's retrospective approval rating, asking people, what do you think now of how he did as president, is higher than it's ever been when he was president. So I think that's the biggest challenge for her. Look, I'm not as plugged in, obviously, to the sort of inner workings, but the reporters here who are, who I've heard from and talked to, the impression I just get from them is she feels a real sense of like loyalty. I'm not going to throw Joe Biden under. It seems to matter to her that she not be seen doing that. Exactly why, where that comes from, but that's something. It seems to be. I've got the impression is at work. Maybe.
I want to step back for a minute and talk to you about an extraordinary book that I am pleased to be promoting here on the podcast. One of the subjects of our November cover, which is called October 8th Jews. The book is Bernard-Henri Lévy's Israel Alone. Bret Stephens has a very long essay delving into the themes of Lévy's book. Lévy is, of course, probably the most prominent French intellectual of our time, a man who has been given credit for changing the nature of the European intelligentsia with his response, as well as various others, people who were called the New Philosophes in the early 70s, to the Soviet Union and to Marxism in general as a result of his reading of the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Lévy is a French Jew, writes in French, and has been writing about Israel since 1967 from the perspective of a unambiguous, though not uncritical Zionist. And this is a portrait of his reactions to the state of Israel after October 7th. He arrived on October 8th, traveled immediately to the three affected kibbutzim, where he had been, as he says, almost sort of in a prophetic manner. He had actually been there right after the 67 war to the three kibbutzim that were hit, walked around, saw the unbelievable damage, smelled the unbelievable smells of carnage, and goes systematically through in this book. It's really an argument. It's a kind of, I wouldn't call it a rant, but it is a passionate polemic about the assaults on Israel, the assaults on Israel's legitimacy and sovereignty in the wake of October 7th, expressing the same kind of feelings and concerns that we have had since then about the fact that this attack opened the floodgates for hostility toward Israel and open anti-Semitism in the United States and in France and elsewhere. It is a extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily focused, almost has writing from a tone of near prophecy, and it's brief, to the point, and pretty close to being the definitive argument about why Israel is not only necessary, but why it now, standing alone as it does, with the partial exception of the United States, and he goes into Biden being good and then conditional about Israel as he sees it, still leaves Israel alone, and why, in fact, this is the condition of the Jewish people from time immemorial, and it is the burden and the benefit and the privilege that we carry to be alone among the nations in the way that we are alone. He says the main thing about what happened on October 7th is that it put Israel in the same position emotionally as the diaspora, the non-Israeli Jewish populaces of the earth, in terms of feelings of insecurity. And the diaspora itself then came to feel like Israel in terms of their, particularly in America, their own or our own insecurity, and how that bind. It's not just Israel alone then, it's basically the Jewish people alone. And we are sort of meant to be alone in a funny way. And that's part of the theme of this extraordinary book. So that is Israel Alone by Bernard Henri Levy. That's Bernard Henry Levy. If you want to try to remember it more easily when you go to the bookstore or go to Amazon, Levy. As I say, the most important French intellectual of the past half century. It's a real contribution to our international discourse that this book exists, and we are thankful that he and his publisher have chosen to use commentary to sponsor the commentary podcast in offering a discussion of his book. And you can go to commentary.org, to our November issue, and read Bret Stephens' remarkable piece about Levy's book. Steve, it's time for you to do the thing we love the most, people like us. Where are you going to look on Tuesday night? What are your 10? What I assume it's usually narrow. You usually have these bellwethers that are your personal picks for how you're going to try to figure out how the evening is going. So maybe you can give us a preview of what we should write down now to keep in mind for next Tuesday.
I mean, sure. Yeah. I mean, how long you got? But it's so a couple early ones that maybe are not as obvious. 6:30, we're going to start getting results from Indiana and Kentucky, two non-competitive states. Big bedroom community suburb just north of Indianapolis, Hamilton County, rapidly growing, and it just typifies the suburban shift, the high educational attainment, higher income suburban shift towards the Democrats. This thing has moved like 30 points more Democratic since Mitt Romney ran in 2012. I think they got it down. The Democrats did to 7 points in 2020. Is Hamilton County flipping? It's an early sign. If we get those, and it's just, Indiana can be a little weird with its results, but if we get an early report from Hamilton County, we might get a sign early about, is that suburban shift that nationally has fueled Democrats, is that alive and well? 7 o'clock hour, Florida used to be obviously the big swing state. We don't expect at this time. We're open to a surprise. But the one county, there's a few, but one county I will key in on right away, just in light of recent events, is Osceola County, which is just outside Orlando. It is one of the 3 majority Hispanic counties in Florida. Of them, it has the highest concentration of Puerto Rican voters. 1/3 of residents of Osceola County are Puerto Rican. It is a place, we talked about the Hispanic vote becoming more Republican in 2020. It absolutely happened there. It was one of the biggest shifts towards the Republicans in Florida in 2020. So look, if there's a last minute effect from this rally, as some people have suggested and Democrats hope, we'll see it. We may see it early in Osceola County, and then we're just rolling. There's a couple places I'll spend a lot of North Carolina looking at a couple of counties just outside Charlotte. The Charlotte suburbs. When I talk about these suburbs that haven't fully made that shift to the Democrats, that are still big vote banks for Republicans, that's the Charlotte suburbs, sort of built by the banking industry. But there's been some slippage. It's the kind of place where the Republicans believe they've stopped the bleeding, essentially. So a county like there's Union County, which is a big one right outside Charlotte, 30 points for Trump in 2016, down to 24 in 2020. Do the Republicans stop that and maybe claw back a little bit, or does it continue? That's a key test. Then we're off and running into, Pennsylvania, Michigan. We could go through all those too. I'm happy to. And another early test quickly that might segue into those later Midwest states. I always look in Florida on the Gulf Coast, just north of Tampa, Pasco County. If you're seeing something early in Pasco, you might be seeing it later in Michigan and Wisconsin. A lot of Midwest retirees who come down there. That was the early alert in 2016 that something bigger than just Pasco County might be happening.
So in North Carolina, as I recall, in 2022, we were watching you. There was excitement because there was a competitive Senate race, right, between
Sherry Beasley. Yeah.
Sherry Beasley was the Democrat. And I think the thought was, well, this is a race that Bud should win. And Beasley was racking up numbers around Charlotte, and it was a much longer night for Bud than people expected, though I think he ended up winning by 3 or something like that. So that of course, this is always the question about this. It was a very big turnout in 2022 for a midterm election, but I guess we expect at least a 30% higher turnout or something like that in the presidential year than or more than in a midterm. And though the midterm voter, if you can expect the midterm voters to vote, they're going to vote. And then the question is who's additional to that. But I'm just trying to think of what happened in 2022 that suggests there are things to look at in 2024. That's when Democrats did better than people thought that they were going to do, particularly in the Senate races. Are there places like that where you're going to look at that 2022 overlay and say that's where we're going to see whether or not Trump, the Trump voter is there, that this Trump voter you're talking about that's so hard to find because maybe he hasn't voted before, he doesn't answer his phone or whatever, that he is there, and that he is, and if he's there in Door County, although Wisconsin, though I guess that's just Republican anyway, but if he's there, he'll be there, in other places as well where things are closer.
Yeah, I mean, a couple ways I'm approaching that. To Carolina specifically, right. I mean, I think one of the lessons of 2022 about North Carolina in particular that we're seeing play out in 24 is while it is basically a Republican state, Republicans don't run away with elections in North Carolina. The Democrats are able to get up to that, 47, 48% mark, even in defeat pretty consistently. And, so what the Democrats think will make the difference for them in North Carolina this time, and this is a thing I'll be watching for there, in eastern North Carolina, there's a collection of counties with largely rural with large black populations. The black populations have been declining a bit in some of these counties, but Democrats believe that's an area where the turnout for them has lagged election after election after election, including in 2022. They thought they would have gotten closer in 2022 if they'd done better there. They believe with Harris, with more investment. So there's a whole collection of those counties. When Barack Obama won the state in 2008, he was through the roof there. So I want to see there in North Carolina. That's a variable this time around. But to the broader question, this is particularly true in the northern tier, the battleground, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Each state I have basically split up into, in my mind and sort of in spreadsheets here, into 3 zones. But there's 2 that I'm going to look at in each one of those states to get to the question you asked, which is I call them the red zone counties and the blue surge counties. And we use 2012 as the baseline, the last pre-Trump election. So Mitt Romney was the Republican nominee against Barack Obama. In a state like Michigan, How many? Barack Obama won Michigan by 10. Trump flipped it. Biden won it by 2.5 points. So it's on the whole gotten significantly more Republican in the Trump era. Where in Michigan have Democrats actually done better than they did back in that Obama election? There's 9 counties, and they're very predictable sort of demographically. So those are my blue surge counties. Then the other question is most of Trump's gains in these Midwest states came in 2016. And then he either retained those gains and then jumped 3, 4, 5 points in 2020, or there was give back. And he lost some ground. And that's how he lost these states. But my red zone counties are the ones where Trump gained more than the statewide average in 2016, retained those gains, and built more in 2020. And I want to see if there's an imbalance in the turnout between those two groups. Because that's when we start talking about, when I said earlier, turnout disparities perhaps driving this thing, I think the Democrats kind of feel, a combination of fears about Trump, January 6th, abortion, all these things are going to drive that blue surge turnout in a way they did in 2022. And the Republicans think there's a Trump-specific factor that maybe didn't work for them fully in 2022 that comes back, and you'll see it in those red zones. So I'm going to compare those in each state as we go.
So that brings me to a related question. You mentioned like abortion and January 6th and things like that. One of the discussions we have on here often is what works, what arguments work and are convincing. We have this debate a lot about, does it make more sense for Democrats to talk issues? Should they just say abortion, 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 or whatever's working for them? Or is there a reason in the waning days they've gone back to fascists, the dark clouds of fascism are descending upon the continent, whatever, that sort of message, which are very different. And we've now had Trump, people have been running against Trump for president for nearly a decade. How do we, from voters, from, polls, surveys, everything that you look at in a decade of information, how do we know what works, and how do we still not know after 10 years whether they should be talking about January 6th and the threat to democracy, or these issues and things like that? How do we sort out the messaging from something that we should theoretically have a decade's worth straight of data on?
Well, there was a new survey that came out yesterday, a more comprehensive. You're talking about tens of thousands of interviews conducted over a month period. One of the findings from it did ultimately show an advantage for Harris over Trump, but one of the findings from it was that the voters who you would consider more up for grabs in this election, they follow politics, less closely. Their voting history is shaky at best. The issues that they say resonate with them are issues of economy, inflation, cost of living, this sort of thing, not January 6th and democracy, that sort of message. The voters who are the most plugged in and vote the most reliably, January 6th scores very high with, and concerns about this sort of thing with Trump. So it becomes a question. I don't know the answer. And we'll probably read into the results to find this. But right, if you're the Democrats, if you're the Harris campaign, do you think that given the issue, all the negative ratings for the Biden administration on the economy, it's a better bet to play up the other stuff and just try to crank up turnout with your base as much as possible. And again, they think they can grow through abortion. They think they can grow particularly turnout among young women or single women, more broadly speaking. Is that the play versus trying to win an argument, on the economy that, with Biden's ratings what they are and Harris being the incumbent vice president, there's only so much you can do.
So it's an interesting moment for us to be talking about this, because as we are recording this, the GDP numbers have come out, and they are really good. It's 2.8% growth in the quarter. Now, that's a slight regression from last quarter when I think growth was 3%, but it's still well over the historical average of the last 15 years. And therefore, in theory, though we are 6 days out from the election, Harris should be able to go out there and say, we're doing it. We're growing, we're growing 30% faster than than we were 2 years ago. We're coming out of it. Gas prices are below $3. Things are, happy days are here again. And they know this is a very weird thing. They know that message isn't resonating. She barely talked about it.
It's not night. Weird. It's perfectly understandable.
Okay.
And
Why?
it is, at least to me, maybe I'm misguided here, but she does not. The reason she keeps repeating over and over again when asked a direct question about the economy that she's from the middle class, and the reason it reads as inauthentic, I think, to a lot of voters is that her social signals are not middle class. She might have been born middle class. There's some debate about that, but nothing about her public persona since she's been in the Senate and now vice president and now running for president signals anything other than upper class, elite, wealthy woman, particularly California elite. I mean, it's her presentation of self. She's a very attractive woman. I'm not criticizing that, but there is a real disconnect. And I think this is where Biden's remark reminds people of Hillary Clinton's deplorables remark, which wasn't just, we think the other side is terrible, stupid, racist, fascist, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of class signaling going on in those remarks. There's a lot of work being done to signal you're not just on the wrong side of the political debate here. You're beneath us. There is some class issues there. And I think she triggers when she starts talking about the economy in a lot of viewers, and not just people who would vote for Trump, but, the suburban, truly middle class family that's still sort of struggling and probably still, despite the GDP numbers, won't be able to afford to send all their kids to the nicer summer camp this summer. They're planning their budgets looking into the next year. She just doesn't read as someone who understands what that sort of life choice, what those sort of day-to-day issues are. She just simply doesn't. In the same way that Nancy Pelosi used to signal that by eating, $15 ice cream bars in front of her $20,000 refrigerator. There's just sort of a disconnect there. And I don't know how that plays out electorally, but just as a class signaling thing, I think that is what disrupts her efforts to talk about the economy and to talk about her understanding of people's day-to-day economic choices.
Can I just add to that also? I think the bigger burden for the Biden administration, for Harris here, is not about GDP growth. It's about prices. And she struggles.
But that's why I say gas prices have dropped. Like, gas prices is one of the 2 or 3 things that people use, like, since they drive past gas stations every day and they see that number dropping. I mean, that number is I drove through the Northeast last week, and everywhere you go, you're kind of startled, even though I don't think that $2.89 is that low a price point. It's not $4.19.
Right. But the question that she always gets asked and has to deal with is grocery prices. And she handles it in some way where she wrestles it back to her contention about building housing somehow. Somehow that, of course, she's going to crack down on price gouging, and building housing.
Okay, but Steve, she has a liability on the economy, and economic data are good. Well, that should help. I mean, not that you have to feel economic data. Like, you can't impose them on people's heads and say macroeconomically. I mean, really, you got nothing to complain about because people don't live in the macro economy, right? But you'd still rather have 2.8% growth than 2% growth going into an election, I assume.
Yeah, although I'll at the risk of bringing up traumatic past memories for you, 1992, in the final days of that campaign, Bush got the best economic news of his presidency. Yeah. And the lesson was the impressions they're lagging. And, it takes a long time for that sentiment to take hold. And the election had already been framed in terms of it's the economy, stupid, and it didn't affect the race, at all. Clinton won on the economy.
Right. That is the exact parallel. People actually thought that the economy was worse, way worse than it was. The recession of '92 was actually very shallow and very short, but it was a recession, came after a war. The war hadn't been won very well, and he was being attacked on two sides, Bush. Right? He had Perot attacking him on the deficit, and he had Clinton attacking him on people's feelings about the economy. Trump doesn't seem to be closing on the economy either. I mean, he says things were better when he's closing on immigration primarily. I mean, that's the thing. That's the thing about this incredibly powerful ad. A couple of these incredibly powerful ads. It's closing on immigration and on transgender issues. Watching the World Series last night, 3 times during the World Series, they ran this ad about how she is for they, them, and Trump is for you. That was, I thought that's pretty interesting because I didn't know that the they, them pronoun game was a thing that had national resonance that people would immediately get. They must, again, they have a lot of money, they have a lot of data, they run things through a lot of focus groups. They must know that bites in some fashion. But yeah, he's not really running on the economy either, except that you had it better under me, I guess, which is an economic.
Well, and more tariffs, which is also bad for the economy.
Yeah, I know, right.
The they, them thing is interesting to me, though, because if you talk to linguists, John McWhorter has written about this, I think, pronoun usage is very encoded. Like our understanding and expectation of what a pronoun signals is very encoded. And it's very disruptive to have to change the way we talk and the way we use pronouns. And in a weird way, it's a separate issue just in terms of how we use language. And I think that's a stand-in for him signaling this is a very rapid change we're making about what gender means and what self-presentation means. And I'm going to say I'm not on board with how quickly this has happened and all the changes that are happening. It really is a perfect stand-in in terms of a rhetorical device to remind people of a whole host of issues, particularly suburban parents who don't like some of the changes in their public school systems, which side of that debate he currently stands on.
Okay, so Steve, let me put it to you this way. So the big book of the late 90s, I guess it was the late 90s, the big political book that everybody had symposia on and everything was Thomas Frank's What's the Matter with Kansas? The idea being that rural voters and people who were in the Republican base were voting against their economic interests because they were being won over by the siren song of social issues that actually had absolutely nothing to do with their own well-being and the things that would be helpful to their families. And it was a very potent theory of everything for a lot of people, particularly who were having people, liberals and people on the left, who just simply could not understand why it was that they couldn't break through with people who seemed to be suffering. Are we in so am I arguing the Thomas Frank what's the matter with Kansas theory here by saying go talk about the economy, like do yourself a favor, use good news in the last week?
I think this is one of the open questions about this election and really more broadly American politics, and that is how much culture war politics and especially just the culture war as it plays out through what our media is evolving into, how much of that has superseded sort of the meat and potato politics we're sort of conditioned to say, win elections. Obviously you run on, the economy, you run on cost. And I'll give you an example here where we were talking earlier about the Trump campaign really kind of banking on new support from young male voters, young male non-white, but white too. I mean, just young male voters in general. And I think this stuff, you're talking, Trump's appeal to them has been through the UFC. It's been through the Joe Rogan podcast. I think it's through pitches like you're describing. I think you're talking about a demographic that I think might be responding to culture war cues and not, well, I want to see my tax rate look like this, or I want to see, I suspect that's the case. Another one, I was talking to somebody here, so this is fresh on my mind, but, we were talking about Michigan, and all the attention in Michigan on, is the Democrats going to lose votes in the, in the Wayne County, Dearborn, Arab Muslim votes around the question of the Gaza war. I think there might be a bit of a sleeper there. Because in the city of Hamtramck, which is, small city, large, this typifies sort of the demographic we're talking about here. One of the big issues this past year was the raising of a pride flag in the city. And this is a Democratic city, and there was a revolt against it, a popular revolt against it. And I think this might be an issue in a place like Hamtramck that's actually animating previous Democratic voters to move toward, and Trump just picked up some endorsements down, in Southeast Michigan, from some Muslim leaders. And I wonder if that's actually, moving it a little bit.
Is that like, what are they seeing that we've been asking this, what are they seeing in Michigan? Is that what the Harris campaign is seeing? And because they've always seemed more worried about Michigan than we think they should be on this particular issue. And they've never released here's the data we're relying on. We've always looked at polls saying, the numbers don't really show that the Arab American community in Michigan is going to swing this election. Are they looking at the Hamtramck and things like that? Is that what they're seeing?
I think it could be. It's that. They're worried about black turnout in Detroit. When you start running, Biden won the state by 154,000. Trump carried it by about 11,000. So that's the range we're talking about here. When you start playing with the numbers, Biden got a plurality of 333,000 votes out of Wayne County. That was winning it by a 68-30 margin. If turnout comes a little bit down disproportionately in Wayne, that's one thing Democrats are very worried about for a variety of reasons. And if Trump gets 4 extra points in Wayne that he didn't get last, and he actually improved in Wayne 2020 relative to 2016. If he jumps to 34, 33, and the Democratic number falls to 65, 66, that 333 comes under 200 pretty quickly. And then the other place, when I look at 154,000, I say it's the most lopsided of these 3 Midwest swing states. It's not hard for me to go through that state and get rid of that 154,000 if I'm looking at it from a Republican perspective pretty quickly. Macomb County, you go north of Detroit, you got Macomb and Oakland, blue-collar suburb Macomb, white-collar suburb Oakland. In 2012, when Trump carried the state, they canceled each other out essentially. In 2020, he's a huge imbalance toward Oakland. Well, if Trump can get his number back in Macomb, again, blue collar, we're talking blue collar stuff that might be responsive to culture war stuff, blue collar voters in Macomb. If you can drive that number back up to what he had in 2016, and if, Oakland comes down just a couple points for the Democrats, you're back in, you've wiped out a 70,000 vote, net Democratic plurality. Just there and just in Wayne, you've probably knocked, 100,000 votes now off that 154,000 vote plurality, excuse me. And then there's just a ton of other places where Trump could get it. So not a prediction he's winning or anything. It's just that, when I first started looking at Michigan, I looked at that 154,000. I said, this has got to be a pretty big lift for the Republicans. And if things break their way, it goes fast.
I just, on this culture war issue, I just want to point out that one of the virtues of populism, virtues isn't the right word, one of the utilities of populism is that it can tie culture war issues to meat and potato issues, at least in voters' minds, because you say they're spending money and resources and people on doing X, on transgendered surgery for whomever, and on drag queen story hour, or whatever, while they're not taking care of the farmers, while they're not taking care of you, while they're stealing your job, while they're shipping out your jobs, and that I don't know to what extent that gets applied and bears fruit for Trump. But I mean, there's a lot of that. I mean, that's why it's become very hard to tease out what is the culture war now and what are the meat and potatoes issues.
Let's move on to a couple of other surprise questions. So, is there a state? There's been a little buzz in the last 4 or 5 days about New Mexico, that maybe New Mexico, which has been a swing state in the past, like that maybe Harris has reason to be worried about New Mexico, and maybe Trump is going to New Mexico, I guess, on Friday or something. Is there a New Mexico, can we look there and see, well, you know what, if Trump is really pushing, or maybe New Mexico is going to be within a point, or Trump wins New Mexico, that's the ballgame. Or this one poll we saw, or 2 polls we saw in New Hampshire that show them neck and neck in New Hampshire. These are states with, I don't know, New Hampshire has 4 electoral votes, New Mexico has 5 or 6 or something like that. It's not like they're going to flip the election, but do you look at those and think,
So I've been fidgeting with my desk here because I wanted to pull out a folder. I don't know if you can read this. This is my break glass folder.
okay.
And so what this is exactly what you're asking about. Outside the battleground, things I have to be ready for in case. So I can I give you my list here, and this is not a, I want to stress before I say it, I'm not necessarily seeing a lot in these states. This is based on noise from the campaigns, and this is based in some ways on how states have voted in the past and demographic breakdowns in states. But my list that's in here is New Hampshire, Virginia, Minnesota, Oregon, New Mexico, Texas. And Texas is in here for the president, but I'm already there for the Senate race, so it's sort of half in this envelope. But the others would be, so there's two ways to look at it. What drives New Hampshire was a Clinton state in 2016. It was the one she won by the narrowest margin. It was 3,000 votes. So New Hampshire is an interesting mix because it does have a high number. We talk about the college-educated whites, non-college whites, two very different political directions. There's a lot of college-educated whites in New Hampshire. There's a lot of non-college whites in New Hampshire too. It can be there for a Republican, and it has been there for Republicans in other statewide races. Minnesota, in 2016, when Trump swept those three Midwest states, he came within 2.5 in Minnesota. Big non-college white population. New Mexico, if it's real, and this one is a very big stretch, but I only say it because if the gains with Hispanic voters that the Trump campaign thinks it can get are realized, the combination of Hispanic voters and non-college white voters in New Mexico, demographically, that's all I'm saying, demographically puts this right in their wheelhouse. And in Oregon, it's a high population. Once you get outside the Portland area, again, it's a high population of non-college white voters. So those are the places I'm kind of getting ready for. And one of the things is it's not necessarily that Trump suddenly wins them. I mean, we'll see what happens. But there's a scenario here, and I have it in a tab right here. Let me see if I can call it. Yes. Okay, here it is. So with that in mind, I've been looking at this concept of the Electoral College popular vote split because we've been seeing the national polls so much closer than they were in 16 and 20, and yet we're seeing the battleground still very close too. Is there a possibility that Trump makes big strides in the national popular vote and is still in trouble in the Electoral College? And sort of doing what I just did there, which is using that non-college white and Hispanic, metric and applying it across the board here, state by state. I'm just looking at the state by state results we got running this thing a couple days ago. He doesn't win any of the states I just mentioned, but he makes some very big strides in them. And I get the popular vote to Harris 49.4, Trump 49.1, 0.3 of a point. Again, he lost it by 4.5 in 2020. And in this scenario I'm looking at right here, Harris still wins the Electoral College 270 to 268. Trump makes all of those gains I'm describing, but doesn't quite flip Michigan, Pennsylvania, or Wisconsin, and Harris just holds on.
Well, in terms of the popular vote, by the way, you have a state like New York. You live here. I live here. We've been watching television for the last 2 months. There are 4 or 5 extraordinarily seriously contested House races on Long Island and in the exurban counties around New York that seem very close and in which there's an enormous amount of money being spent, right? Lawler versus Jones, D'Esposito versus Gillen. Is it Gillen? Did I have that name right? Mm-hmm. Anyway, and all of that. And you could have the weird phenomenon that Trump lost New York by, where is this? What do I have? Like by 25 points, 23 points in 2020. And the House races almost guarantee that he will do better in New York in 2024 than in 2020. It strikes me. If you really have people who are being pulled to the polls almost to vote in the House races, then he'll outperform. That was not the case in 2020. He'll outperform in a large population state like New York. He could win 500,000, 750,000 votes back that he didn't have in 2020 and narrow that popular vote margin. Now, it was 7 million in 2020. So that's not like, doesn't take him half the way there. But if you have something comparable in California, you got a million votes back, 1.5 million votes back that he didn't have or something like that. I'm not saying that he wins the popular vote, but yeah, they could have this like narrowing. Now, you mentioned Texas, and you're looking at the Senate race because we have this close, potentially close Senate race between Ted Cruz and Colin Allred. Where does that look like? How are you going to look at that? Like, is there, because I think if Allred does, not that Harris is going to win Texas, but if she comes really close to winning Texas, that has national ramifications, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the polling is, pretty consistent that, Trump is running probably about 3 points better than Cruz. What I think Cruz is counting on and what Democrats are up against ultimately is just, the partisan gravity of the Trump era, meaning between 2016 and 2020, there was one single state in 2020 and none in 2016 where the presidential and Senate results split by party. That is Maine, Susan Collins, 2020. In every other state, and we've had numerous instances of this in 16 and 20, where the polling in the Senate race looked divergent from the presidential polling, and they converged more or less, on Election Day. So I think that's, it's what the Cruz folks are counting on in Texas. Frankly, that's what Republicans are counting on in a number of these Senate races, and that's what Democrats, have to defy. But that's, you start looking at math for Democrats in the Senate. The attention on Texas is also because they just don't have the map is so aligned against them. They just don't have these pickup opportunities that Republicans have. And honestly, it looms as we could talk about Nebraska in a separate category where there's an independent running against the Republican. But, Texas is the best shot Democrats have to take out a Republican incumbent. And that's what they have to pull off to do it.
Is there anything they should be learning from that Nebraska race? Because it's like a 2-point race in one of the most recent polls I saw, kind of a sleeper thing.
Completely. And, again, this is one where the Republicans kind of believe that, and they certainly got their attention, they're spending money, and they believe that in the end, the partisan gravity of Nebraska, I think that the same poll that had the Senate race had too, state is safely for Trump, will ultimately, you have a number of Trump voters who will ultimately, I'm voting for the Republican. It's been an interesting dance, though, because the Democrats clearly want Osborne, the independent, to win, but they really can't say it. And, and Osborne's insistent, if he wins, he will not caucus with either party, knowing that if he ever answered that, said Democratic, he loses the election on the spot.
That's a weird, the dynamic there is just so unusual because you have this split where the electoral college votes are apportioned by congressional district, as you do in Maine, and you have this. The polling data suggests that it really may split, like that. Is it Nebraska 2, the one around Omaha? That's the district that Democrats may win. You have the weird phenomenon. Although it does seem very weird to go like this. You have a ballot, right? And so you're going to vote for Harris. Then you're going to move over into the independent category on your optical character reading ballot. Vote for Osborne in this column, and as opposed to going down and just voting for the Democrat below Harris.
Well, there is no Democrat. That's the thing the Democrats did. It's going to be blank. Strategically, they just didn't run a candidate.
So. Do you know anyone from Omaha? That totally describes everyone I know. I know like 5 people from Omaha. That totally, that ballot makes perfect sense to them. Yeah, totally.
Okay. All right. But New Hampshire is interesting also because New Hampshire is like the last bipartisan state practically. So you have a Republican governor. You have two Democratic senators. You have. Right now, I believe the Republican Kelly Ayotte, former senator, is leading in the gubernatorial race, but there are 2 contested House races in which the Democrats, particularly Maggie Good, who is the wife of Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, seems to be running away with her race. But Ayotte is apparently going to win the governor's match. So like the ticket split, it's like a ticket splitting state. And so maybe that's why Trump has a shot at it, because there is another weird thing. Like he's a little lifted by the what's going on below him on the ticket, which is not an ordinary thing.
Well, it's also like the two districts, the congressional districts in New Hampshire. One of them is sort of the western part of the state. You're getting into the Connecticut River Valley along the Vermont border. And that part of New Hampshire really politically has kind of become Vermont. It's just become very, very Democratic. It used to be, 20, 30 years ago, it was the old Yankee Republican. The city of Keene, this is where Dartmouth is. This is kind of that corner of the state. You go elsewhere in the state, though, and there are some very what you call Trumpy areas, some old, blue collar industrial small cities, Berlin, New Hampshire up north, Rochester, New Hampshire, kind of getting close to the Maine border. It's a funky state. And as you say, it has a very, very, unique and independent political tradition too.
So just to close out on this, the weird question of these Senate races, which are, we see this closing, as you say, where in Pennsylvania we have a tied race, it would appear, at the top of the ticket, and we have McCormick zooming in on the Republican McCormick zooming in on the Democratic incumbent Bob Casey. We have in Wisconsin Eric Hovde zooming in on the sitting Democratic incumbent Tammy Baldwin, and then this open seat in Michigan. We have two relatively strong candidates. A former House member, one a current House member, or Alyssa Slotkin and Mike Rogers. That's a substantive race there with two pretty policy-heavy people who are running on their skills and abilities and their record as people who are serious about on national security. God. Amazingly enough, there does seem to be a convergence there, and that's maybe what suggests is creating the confidence in Mar-a-Lago that they think they may have the blue wall broken down because they're seeing this other evidence. It's not just Trump. Am I reading that right, or?
Yeah, or it's, again, I tend to think it's this convergence we're talking about, this partisan gravity, sort of asserting itself. Although we say we're not really seeing that, at least in the polling in Arizona, where Kari Lake is the Republican Senate candidate and is consistently still polling under Trump, and in Nevada, where Sam Brown, the Republican nominee, again consistently polling below Trump. So I don't quite know why, but I think the pattern we've seen in 16 and 20, I read Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin as sort of where it's 16 and 20 again. Tell me who wins the state in the presidential, and that's probably who I bet on in the Senate race. But it does seem to be different, certainly in Arizona and Nevada too, it looks like.
I guess the final question I should ask you then is what importance do you attribute, if any, to the fact that Republicans seem to have awakened from their sleeping beauty slumber on the early vote, at least in some of these places, and are at least either competitive or, shockingly enough, leading in the early vote in, is it Georgia and Florida and Arizona, something like Nevada?
No, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Does that mean anything? Or, I mean, I know banking votes good because then if someone's car gets a flat tire, they voted and they can't be stopped from going to the polls. Or do you just look at that as an enthusiasm gauge or whatever?
I'm still at the point where generally it's new, early voting on this mass scale. In some states, it's almost brand new. And so these patterns, these turnout patterns by party are not necessarily that established, and I think they could still bounce around in funky ways from election to election. So I just don't think we really have great baselines to compare a lot of this stuff to. The one exception, most people make, and I do too, is you look at Nevada because John Ralston, political reporter, analyst out there, has a good established track record. It's a state where it's overwhelmingly male early, and it's been done now for decades. So there is a basis for comparison. And Ralston has a track record of, by the end of the early voting period, making predictions like to the 10th of a point that aren't that bad. And his readout on everything that's happened so far is, wow, the Republicans actually have an advantage that they have not had in the past. But even there, I just think politics, Trump era, it's so volatile that if you told me we're going to wake up and we're going to find out that in Nevada, just as for the first time Republicans were more active in this early voting period, Democrats turned out more on election day than we've seen in the past, I wouldn't be shocked. There's just always that possibility. Just think of 2016. How many Democrats thought Clinton had it in the bag, and frankly, how many Republicans assumed Trump had lost, based a lot on these early votings. And then the revelation, starting in Florida when the polls closed, was, wow, this election day turnout is much more than we expected, and it's slanted to these Republican areas. And how do you know that's not going to happen this time, and maybe in reverse?
Yeah, I just want to say I want to congratulate the writers, because from January 2023 until about June 2024, we had an unbelievably flat and boring election going on, in which the vote was being one or another of them was ahead by half a point at any given moment. Maybe a little spread toward Trump against Biden as Biden's infirmity became more pronounced in 2024. But I wrote this piece in January saying this election is the nightmare that will never end. We're just trapped in kind of this closed loop. And then July onward, like, how insane has this been? Candidate flip, to an assassination attempt that nearly succeeds, terrible debate, garbage on Sunday, garbage on Tuesday of the last week. They're just throwing. So I don't even know what's going to happen in the next 6 days.
I think what John is saying is there any way we can prolong this a couple more weeks? Maybe vote in early December?
Yeah, we can.
Close. If it's close, really, it could be 5 days before we have a winner, right? I mean, if 4 states are within half a point, how many states have are there states with mandatory recounts?
I dig it up. Some of them, you have the right at a certain point to do it,
right.
Which obviously either campaign would do. So yeah, I mean, that's what we're prepared for. If it's super, super tight in these states, that's a big variable.
We could have that week of not knowing who's going to be the president. So yeah. So Seth, you may get your wishes may be fulfilled.
Take it back.
No, why shouldn't it end that way? Why shouldn't it? It's all we deserve. Christine, just to close up, you sent out a message on our text chain saying that we had no choice but to make our commentary recommends today. To be a young Frankenstein in honor of Teri Garr, who played Inga and died yesterday at the age of 79 after battling MS for a couple of decades. That was her sort of breakthrough performance, Rolling in the Hay, and all that. I myself think her greatest performance is in Tootsie as the world's most neurotic New York stage actress. One of the signature comic performances of our time, and accurate, like sociologically, personally, emotionally, politically accurate. But you have anything you want to?
I loved her, and I felt like she was one of those actresses who she was in a wide range of things. She was always memorable, but never tried to steal the limelight. And that's she was more than a character actor. She was never always the star. And that's a really hard balance to strike, I think, on the screen. And she somehow managed it. And there was just something about no matter what performance she gave, she was taking such pleasure in it. And she also looked like a real person, which I think nowadays we can't take for granted. I'm so shocked by how many actors and actresses who I've watched for 20 years are now starting to look like AI avatars or something. It worries me. She looked like a real person, but a particularly sharp and funny one. You know, every time she appeared on David Letterman, she was hilarious. Her timing was wonderful. Her comic timing, her dramatic timing. And I just feel, I mean, I love Young Frankenstein anyway, but because that was her breakout role and she was her timing in that was so perfect, I just thought we should encourage anyone who hasn't yet seen that to run and go see it.
You know, most interesting as a performer is that she is somebody who played roles that most people would consider absolutely thankless.
Right.
She was the disbelieving wife of a man to whom something, or the disbelieving girlfriend to a man to whom something extraordinary was happening. And she was sort of like the real world respondent, Richard Dreyfuss's wife in Close Encounters. John Denver's wife in Oh God, he starts being visited by God, and Dustin Hoffman's girlfriend in Tootsie, who does not know that he has taken her part from her, dressing up as a woman and then basically getting her the role that she had tried out for, that he coached her for. And in all of these cases, she could have seemed like a shrew. She could have seemed like a monster. She's sort of cast as the villain in Close Encounters because she keeps saying, don't go looking for aliens. And you still liked her. And in the end, she was, of course, right, because what happens is he leaves his family and goes off in a spaceship, which Spielberg has since apologized for, by the way. He said, if I'd had kids, then I never would have ended it that way. That's not right that happened. But she never had an edge. Like, she had these very difficult parts to play. One tick wrong, one note wrong, and she just like turns into a villain or somebody unsympathetic. And that she was never that. She was always somebody that you liked, even when she was somebody. And that's really, really hard to pull off. So that's Teri Garr. So we have Young Frankenstein as the recommends, although I would also add Tootsie or Close Encounters or Oh God, which is a delightful, strange movie, time capsule movie of its time, or Mr. Mom, where she plays the woman who has to go off to work because her husband loses his job. Anyway, sad story. She really did get, slammed by a terrible disease and spent, 2 decades dealing with it, which is why she kind of disappeared from the scene. And she might well have been somebody like Carol Kane or one of the people of her own age who would have, been somebody we would have been seeing through into her 70s and having renaissances and all of that. But Teri Garr, Steve Kornacki, thank you so much. One of the great pleasures of the ending of the election season is that you step forward and take center stage. And I remember Leslie Jones of SNL doing these bits in 2016 where she would just scream, Steve, like on Twitter or on Instagram, watching you like with her, showing her camera. So we're all like that. We're all going to be watching you and taking your insights. And I really thank you for joining us today. And
thank you.
Reminding us about Hamilton County and Osceola County.
There you go. Yeah.
And the red zone and the blue surge and all that. So
you were taking notes. I'm flattered.
We're ready.
Yeah. Excellent.
Thanks again. And for Abe, Seth, and Christine, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.